Okay, welcome to Finance 301, Principles of Finance. This is Module 4, Capital Budgeting and Capital Structure, Case 4. We are going to discuss the Excel IRR function, internal rate of return, relative to your Case 4 today. So IRR determines the IRR of a series of cash flows in cells N1, N2, N3. So let's say you have a column or a row, it doesn't matter, of cells. And I'm labeling them M1, N2, N3. It might be A1, B1, C1, D1, or A1, A2, A3, A4. It's going to pull from that row or column of data, and then it's going to apply a guess factor, and then it's going to use that to come up with a internal rate of return. So your series of numbers goes with a colon in between of it that identifies the row or column. Inside the IRR functions, they have equals IRR in your Excel cell, N1 colon N5, that selects the cell to pull from, the group of cells to pull from, and then you have comma, and then you have the guess rate. So the guess rate in this case is 0.5. It's assumed to be 10, so it'll assume that the guess rate is 0.10. So if it's left blank, and it just needs that to do this calculation. So NPV is the present value of a project, right? What is IRR? IRR is the interest rate that's going to get the present value to 0 after I subtract out the initial investment. So that's also called a hurdle rate. So in other words, the IRR is taking and it's guessing at what the interest rate is that if we summed up all the cash flows of the project minus the initial investment would get the value to 0. So you have to beat the IRR as rate of return in order to have positive returns. And so this is how you figure out the IRR in Excel. You just need to plug in a guess rate. You can just put in 0.1. It doesn't really matter what guess rate you pick, but you have to give the computer a guess rate so it can make the assumptions needed to do the calculation. Okay, so in the last question here for the Module 4 case, they're talking about debt versus equity in the capital structure, the debt versus equity mix. And so debt is advantageous because the interest on that debt is tax deductible. All publicly traded corporations in America are taxable, as are most other businesses in the United States. They're taxable. So when you borrow money in a business and use that money in your business, you can write off the interest on that debt as a tax deduction. And so these tax deductions lower the effective cost of capital associated with debt. So for example, let's assume the tax rate's 30% and the interest on a loan is 5% pre-tax. Then the interest rate is only 3.5% after we take into account the tax benefits, right? Because 30% of 5% is 1.5%, and that 1.5% minus 5% is 3.5%. So the tax benefit of deducting that interest on your tax return is enough to reduce the borrowing cost from 5% to 3.5%. Now, if you used equity financing, you can't deduct that. So there'd be no tax deduction, which makes equity more expensive than debt when you take into account the tax benefits. If a company retires half of its outstanding debt, half of its outstanding equity through a debt offering. So if a company retires half of its outstanding equity through a debt offering, and it had 40% equity financing and 60% debt to begin with, this means the new ratio is going to be 80-20, 80% debt, 80% equity, because I've got 40% of equity. I'm going to borrow money to buy back half of it. So that takes me, half of 40% is 20%. And then the dollar amount of debt I'd have to buy to get rid of 20% of my equity would be 20% more debt. So now I have 80% debt and 20% equity instead of 40% equity and 60% debt. If the tax rate is 15%, the cost of equity is 7%, and the corporate debt has a 3% pre-tax interest rate, the cost of capital is going to be, first you have to weight the cost of equity by the percentage of equity in the capital structure. That's 20% times the cost of equity, that's 7%. That gets you 1.4% weighted cost. And then you're going to take 80%, which is the weight of the debt in the equity, the debt in the capital structure. You're going to take that 80% times 3%, the borrowing rate, minus the tax benefit of the borrowing rate, which is 15% of 3% or 0.45%. 3% minus 0.45% is 2.55%. 1.4% plus 80% of 2.55%. Again, we have to weight that borrowing cost, that tax-adjusted borrowing cost, by the percentage of debt in the capital structure, which is 80%. 1.4% plus 80% of 2.55% is 3.44%. That's our total cost of capital. Now, the question asks you to think about to what extent does and of course the numbers are different in the actual case than on the slide, but the concepts are similar. They ask you to what extent does the elimination of the corporate tax rate impact all of this, and at the same time retiring half of the debt. So the elimination of the corporate tax rate is going to increase the cost of capital. It's going to raise it from 2.5% to 3% because we no longer get a tax deduction for the interest. So it actually raises the cost of capital, the elimination of the tax rate. However, we retired half of our equity. Our equity was more expensive than our debt. Equity had 7% cost, debt had a 3% cost. So does does the elimination of the tax rate increase our cost of capital on a net basis when you take into account that we eliminated that debt, or does the amount of debt we eliminated actually decrease the cost of capital by more than the elimination of the tax rate increases it? And that depends on the math, on the spread between the two rates. That's a question you'll have to answer yourself based upon the inputs. But that's really what the question's about. We know that the cost of equity is more expensive than the cost of debt. So when we retire the debt, we'd expect our cost of capital to go down. I'm sorry, when we retire the equity using debt, we'd expect the cost of our capital to go down. And we know that when we eliminate the corporate tax rate, it makes our cost of equity, our cost of capital go up, cost of debt could go up, and our cost of capital to go up. So, which of these overrules in this situation based on the amount of debt that got retired and the spread between the cost of equity and the cost of debt?